we are going to resume this afternoon's breakout topics here on Channel 1 with our next speaker, Alexa Rad, asking the rather provocative question, did the internet kill democracy? Society is a consensual delusion in a lot of ways. It only functions if we all believe in it. And belief in that society is based on trust and shared facts. But the internet has rather famously given us alternative facts, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years. Along the way, did the internet kill democracy? Alexa Rad is a cybersecurity expert, and she's been advisor to DARPA's Active Social Engineering Defense Organization. She's also the co-founder of the TechSequences podcast and the Chief People Policy and Purpose Officer for Human Security. We asked her here to talk about these issues and answer the real question, has the internet killed a lot of what we believe in, from free speech and organized society to democracy itself? So welcome, Alexa Rad.
So, as Alistair said, the topic is, did the internet kill democracy? Before we answer the question, let's look at what was the original promise of the internet and how it evolved. We'll look at information warfare and its impact on democracy. And lastly, we'll look at whether we can mitigate the impact of information warfare, and particularly disinformation. So the internet's original promise. In 1999, the columnist Thomas Friedman pronounced that the post-Cold War world, that the geopolitical system, which was symbolized by this one searing image of the Berlin Wall, was dead. Instead, he said that we were in an age of globalization where we had gone from a system built around walls to a system increasingly built around networks, cooperation, and interdependence. Not surprisingly, in his view, the one thing that characterized globalization the best was the World Wide Web. Interdependence, in effect, describes the internet. The internet's attributes of universal reach, low cost, networking, speed, interactivity, all mirrored the aspiration for what globalization could deliver, namely a more tightly integrated world where there was flow of goods and services, and where ideas would be unfettered by borders. Back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, leading experts, economists, politicians, technologists, journalists even, waxed poetic about the egalitarian impact of the internet, namely that as the internet spread all over the world, it would give power to the voiceless and the marginalized, leading to the fall of the autocrats and reordering the power dynamics around the world. Bill Clinton famously quipped that dictatorships trying to crack down on the internet is sort of like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. More generally, the internet was considered as a revolution, kind of like print and gunpowder were back in their day, something that would actually change society permanently and irrevocably. That last prediction is undeniably true. The internet seemed a natural ally for the pro-democracy and reform movements around the world. The Saffron Revolution in 2008, the Iranian Green Revolution of 2009, the Arab Spring of 2010. Incidentally, later research into the Arab Spring and the Saffron Revolution and the impact of the internet and social media showed that the impact wasn't necessarily causal, rather that internet and social media played a very important role in communicating what was happening on the ground to the outside world. Even so, at that time, there was still optimism that the internet was this unconquerable Leviathan and that the autocratic regimes were not going to get their arms around it. The internet was instrumental in the Idle No More movement, and more recently in the social media platforms and internet are credited with jumpstarting or fostering social justice movement. For example, the videos that were captured by ordinary citizens and uploaded to various platforms created increased public awareness and generated conversation about excessive police force towards African Americans. Same with the umbrella movement, pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. and organizing the Women's March in 2017 across the globe and again in 2021, and the Me Too movement. But the internet is also credited for amplifying the disinformation and conspiracy theories which led to the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. But first, let's talk about what we mean by disinformation and misinformation, because there is a distinction. Misinformation is falsehood that is not deliberate. It is not meant to harm. Disinformation, on the other hand, is deliberate. It is malicious. Both of them have a kernel of truth, which make them believable. Hoax and conspiracies are these fabricated stories that masquerade as truth, and they're on the disinformation side. Now, the earlier promise of the internet has given way to the concern that the very features, the interdependence, the openness that made the internet so democratic are now, in fact, endangering democracy itself. In other words, the freedom of information online can be weaponized to damage democracy because it makes it vulnerable to all the darker sides of the internet, which is hate speech, incitement to violence, disinformation, and foreign interference in elections. Disinformation has become the weapon of choice for nation-state adversaries. So why? Well, first of all, conventional warfare has a high infrastructure cost, boots on the ground, tanks, battalions. Disinformation does not. Conventional warfare, particularly in first world countries, requires a formal declaration of war that has to go through multiple levels of government. Not so in disinformation. It is hard to surprise the enemy in conventional warfare, whereas in disinformation, you can surprise them in many ways. In fact, the target often doesn't even know that it's been attacked until some time later. Disinformation erodes institutions, whereas conventional warfare strengthens institutions. And disinformation actually is egalitarian in a way because it empowers those who were previously considered as weak because they did not have the means or the power of being able to afford a conventional warfare. But most of all, disinformation is such an effective weapon because you sow seeds of internal destruction by undermining the socio-political systems and delegitimizing key institutions and eroding trust. Rome, it is said, fell long before the first barbarians climbed its gates. Whereas conventional warfare unites the citizens against a common external enemy, disinformation pits citizen against citizen by rendering them as the enemy, thus enrolling the citizen in their own destruction. The stakes are high. Disinformation threatens our ability to effectively combat a deadly virus that is global. It affects our ability to hold free and fair elections and even deal with existential change like existential threats like climate change. We live in strange times. We are battling two pandemics, both viral. One is a virus called COVID, and another a virus called disinformation. In the case of COVID, the virus is the novel coronavirus, whereas with disinformation, it's just a nugget of deliberately contrived and malicious falsehood. Both of them require contact for transmission. Both require receptive hosts. In the case of COVID, that's someone who's unvaccinated or someone who is more prone to disinformation or has low immunity. Disinformation tends to prosper among those who are also vulnerable, in this case, maybe because of their circumstances, beliefs, or cognitive biases. Both of them have what is called super spreaders. In other words, individuals who manage to transmit and infect a disproportionately large share of the population by virtue of their presence and activities. Both of them have super spreading events. In the case of COVID, this can be an event that attracts a large part of the population to interact with one another with a disproportionately high contact rate. With disinformation, these are topics that tend to attract individuals who will then copy, transmit, spread this content that's related to that topic. Things like anti-vax, think QAnon, both inside their echo chambers and beyond. Both have super spreading platforms. In other words, places where both virtual and real, where the viral load is high. So in the case of COVID, think geographic locations that have a high concentration of infected individuals. In the case of disinformation, think about platforms that attract and then amplify this falsehood. Lastly, both behave in the same way. Once they infect a critical mass, then they take off and their spread becomes exponentially faster and further. There is one key difference, though. We have found a vaccine that inoculates individuals against COVID. Not so with disinformation. Just as a virus targets those with low immune thresholds, disinformation targets those who are also vulnerable. So those with low media literacy. A lower education level doesn't necessarily mean that you are more prone to believe disinformation. However, a Pew Research study found that people who were college-educated adults were better at distinguishing between political fact from political opinion. The rapid changes that were brought about by globalization has meant that long-standing social and economic orders were disrupted. This left a number of people feeling disenfranchised and also resentful of the new order. So authoritarians as varied as Mussolini and Putin to Erdogan have successfully leveraged this feeling of disenfranchisement by harking back to a mythical and once glorious past. Our cognitive and psychological vulnerabilities make us susceptible as well. Just think about this. Our brains can process only about 120 kilobits per second and can only do so serially. Yet every day we are deluged with 34 gigabytes of information. So we take cognitive shortcuts like making decisions based on our intuition or prior learning. This is what's called System 1 thinking from Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. This is just a coping mechanism to deal with information overload. On top of that, you have cognitive biases. So there are no less than 104 named cognitive biases. Amongst them include confirmation bias, tendency to believe what you already believe, authority bias, and even clustering bias. This is, when you see trends in what is otherwise random data bits. Interestingly enough, confirmation bias is more prevalent with individuals who have anxiety and see the world as a more dangerous place. Research has shown that conservatives are statistically more prone to anxiety and threat-related attentional biases. And lastly, this is my favorite, the Dunning-Kruger effect, which holds that those with low ability often overestimate their own competence. In other words, the less you know, the less likely it is that you recognize your own competence. The term viral refers to something that is circulated widely and rapidly from one person to another. Viruses follow a similar path. In other words, first it's contact, then it's transmission, infection, and then exponential spread. We talked about how disinformation spreads in much the same way. In 2018, a study from MIT analyzed more than 126,000 stories, some of them false, some of them true, that circulated between 2006 and to the end of 2016. They found that the misleading or incorrect stories traveled 6 times faster and reached more people. In fact, falsehoods were 70 times more likely to be retweeted than the truth. In all categories of false news, it was the political news that traveled faster and further. So why is that? Well, lies are more interesting than the truth. If the truth is vanilla, lies are rocky road. They have novelty. They have shock value. They carry an emotional load. They make you angry, bring up disgust, fear, and therefore a higher chance of a reply. In epidemiology, a superspreader is an infected person who manages to spread the virus to a large number of other people. Disinformation has superspreaders as well, and the best ones are called bots. In 2020, researchers from Carnegie Mellon University culled through more than 200 million tweets that were discussing the virus since January of that year. And they found that 45% of them were sent by accounts that behave more like computerized bits of code than humans. They identified more than 100 distinct false narratives about COVID-19 that were proliferating on Twitter by accounts controlled by bots. These tweets, they said, appeared aimed at sowing division in America, and that pattern fit the pattern of Chinese and Russian propaganda. The Election Integrity Partnership, which is a group that includes Stanford and the University of Washington, analyzed social media platforms, including YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, during several months before the election of 2020 and then afterwards. In their report, they identified Trump, his two sons, and other members of the administration and the very conservative right-wing media as super spreaders who were responsible for the most frequent and most impactful of these information campaigns. Super spreaders tend to be associated with specific disinformation campaigns and or topics. We talked about QAnon and other conspiracy theories, obviously elections. COVID-19 myths and vaccines are also a favorite target. So the Center for Countering Digital Hate released a report in 2021 analyzing content posted or shared to social media over 812,000 times between February and March, and found that 65% of all vaccine-related or anti-vax-related messages could be contributed to only 12 super spreaders. One of the most influential of them is this anti-vax conspiracy theorist is someone called Dr. Joseph Mercola. He is a natural health advocate and osteopathic physician. Perfect case example of authority bias. He has over 1.7 million followers on Facebook and over 300,000 followers on Twitter and Instagram each. And he actively shares his views about anti-vax. He sells his book and he sells supplements. For a disinformation campaign to succeed, though, it has to be well-planned. It has to be orchestrated. So this is a graphic by the MITRE Corporation describing the process for a disinformation campaign. So the process is initiated by a threat actor, a bad actor, with malicious intent, and then it goes all the way through the campaign to deliver the desired objective. To make that process even more simpler, let's think about it as 5 stages: reconnaissance, weaponization, attack, and infection. So the first step is reconnaissance. This is the stage where the bad actor identifies their target or their adversary. They study that audience, they study their vulnerabilities, and they study their behaviors and plan that campaign in such a way to exploit it. The next stage is the weaponization stage. This is where those nuggets of disinformation content are crafted. So they take a bit of truth and they craft this false narrative around this. This is also the stage where they set up their computing infrastructure to carry out the attack. At the attack stage, the actor seeds this disinformation content into various platforms. So you'll see them creating and promoting various hashtags. They try to insert this into various conversations in a way to leverage the existing algorithms, so to amplify it. At the infection stage, this is where bots drive engagement, especially targeting this vulnerable or targeted population. Now, remember that I said falsehood travels 6 times faster and wider than the truth. So the truth is already at a disadvantage from the get-go. Now, imagine that a disinformation campaign that has an organized structure that is really targeted to amplify this lie in an exponential way. So what is that structure? Well, the foot soldiers are the bots. Bots are just programmatic code that run automated tasks. Now, not all bots are bad. Some bots run the index web pages, or they crawl text to look for various errors. These are not the bots we're talking about. The bots employed here are for a malicious task, and their aim is to pass on the message, spread the message in a way that looks authentic. The next level is called cyborgs. These are a kind of hybrid account that combine the automation of the bot with the craftiness of human intellect. So cyborgs are those that where the human takes over at times, periodically, takes over the bot account, either to respond to users or to shift the narrative or create new content. They are harder to detect as a result, but also more expensive. Trolls are the humans. Trolls were traditionally thought of as people who were the agitators who provoked other people for their amusement. In this context, they are in the employment of a bad actor or a nation state. Peter Pomerantsev, in his book, This Is Not Propaganda, describes self-styled PR companies for hire in the Philippines. And we'll talk about those in a minute. The structure depicted here is that structure that they've set up. It's also the structure of the infamous Russian troll farm, otherwise known as the Russian Internet Research Agency. Amplification is the most crucial stage for the success of any disinformation campaign. So here, the old adage applies. If a tree falls and no one hears it, does it make a sound? Without viral spread, there is just an infection and no pandemic. Infections are easier to deal with and therefore less catastrophic than a pandemic. The key to battling disinformation is mitigating that process before the amplification part takes off, but more on that later. The political climate of the early days of the internet has changed drastically. So globalization has taken a beating in recent years with the rise of separatist movements, nationalist movements, separatist movements like Brexit, nationalist movements like America First. And concurrently, democracy's been in retreat. I appreciate this quote from Thomas Jefferson because he points out that a well-informed electorate is the best insurance policy against wayward governments. However, an appreciation for facts and adequate discernment or distinction between opinion and fiction is a prerequisite to having a well-informed electorate. Free and fair elections are fundamental to democracy. So this graphic from Freedom House shows that 88% of countries that held elections or referendums between June of 2018 to May of 2020 experienced digital interference in their elections. In 2016, the Russian government operated a disinformation campaign to interfere with US elections. Only later did we understand and appreciate the full extent of their operation. For example, Twitter later disclosed that foreign interference in 2016 involved over 4,600 accounts, most of them affiliated with the Russian Internet Research Agency. And there were more than 10 million suspicious tweets and more than 2 million GIFs or memes and videos that where bots played a major role in spreading and amplifying that content. But US was not alone. The influence campaigns have been credited with interference in the 2012 elections. In fact, Peñabot was a term that was coined in those elections where a suspected network of automated accounts on social media that was used by the incumbent PRI party that has been in power for a long time in Mexico spread pro-government propaganda and was stifling dissenting opinions on social media. The 2016 election of Duterte in the Philippines is widely credited to be a successful disinformation campaign. Number one, they raised his profile, created an agenda for him, but they also used it to discredit and harass political opinions, including Maria Ressa, the winner of this year's Nobel Prize. Incidentally, the Philippines is known for a thriving cottage industry of PR companies who are thinly veiled influence operations for hire. They have tested their mettle with the election of Duterte, and since 2016, they've changed their tactics a little bit. They've gone underground. They're now developing micro-targeted campaigns where they see disinformation in a very partisan way. Their messages, they plant messages that have some sort of emotional appeal. They use humor. They use satire, snarky satire, even sometimes inspirational messages and memes. And inspirational quotes to attract attention. This way, what they found is that they could actually engage an audience that otherwise would not be interested in politics, so expanding their sphere of influence. Disinformation campaigns are also credited with the success of the Brexit referendum. This shows a graphic of a pro-Brexit bot. Same with the 2018 election of Bolsonaro in Brazil. A WhatsApp campaign there was instrumental in his election. The manipulation of public opinion through social media is a growing threat. This is according to a 2020 media manipulation survey coming out of University of Oxford. In this report, it said that organized social media manipulation campaigns now operate in 81 countries, up from 70 in 2019. And it is being produced on an industrial scale by governments and public relations firms and political parties. Bottom line, this influence campaign is actually becoming the norm. In these campaigns, 79 countries used human accounts, 57 used bot accounts, and 17 used hacked or stolen accounts. So it's not surprising democracy's been in decline. This visual is again from Freedom House that tracks democracies around the globe. This chart shows countries with aggregate score declines in freedom in the world have outnumbered those with gains every year for the past 15 years. Consider that only 10% of the population now live in democracies. Canada is one, so consider yourself lucky. With the backdrop of the sobering quote from Maria Ressa, let's consider the consequences of influence campaigns. These are deepening divides in the US and elsewhere, increasing violence against individuals, ethnic groups, racial minorities, religious minorities, and resistance to vaccination efforts in the midst of a raging global pandemic. So our stakes is not just the survival of democracy and trust in public institutions and elections, but it really is the well-being of ourselves and the planet we live on. So did the internet kill democracy? Well, the short answer is it's complicated. Tyrants don't win just by the virtue of their message. They win by exploiting existing vulnerabilities and manipulating citizens to become hostile to democratic institutions. The preconditions of democracy's retreat were already there. They predate internet and social media and are because of anxieties produced by rapid change, social economic changes, globalization, transformation from a manufacturing to information society. But so it's superficial to blame technology for a phenomenon that has much deeper roots. And also, we're the ones who design and create the technology, not the other way around. Having said that, though, it does not help. In other words, the business model behind many of the internet platforms called surveillance capitalism encourages harvesting of data to feed opaque algorithms that drive us deeper into these echo chambers. And that has this addictive nature that when combined with our cognitive and psychological vulnerabilities, we become increasingly malleable to manipulation and increasingly detached from objective reality. So if an informed electorate is the backbone of democracy, then what better way to hack democracy than by hacking the truth? So is there hope? There's been a lot of things that have already been proposed, including changes in product. For example, the Facebook whistleblower was talking about changes in increasing age limits, for example, for Instagram, or changing the default settings, changing algorithms. The tech platforms themselves are doing some sort of self-regulation. They do content moderation, flagging of content, labeling, deplatforming of individuals and groups. But the results have been mixed because in some cases, it has not been evenly applied. Case in point, the whistleblower's testimony on Capitol Hill. There are consistent cries for government regulation from both far right and far left, and especially for changing or revoking Section 230, which dates to 1996, which effectively says platforms are not responsible for the content. The best cure, of course, is better media literacy and education, but that's so far away and it's hard and it's a long slug. So it still doesn't address the fact that we all have psychological and cognitive biases and traps. If we are to better understand influence campaigns and what measures would be effective or more effective than others, we need to have some consistent data and firsthand data. Right now, tech companies are not compelled to provide data. They're not compelled to provide transparency or audit. By the way, other than fact-checking, there really isn't that much research out there. And fact-checking itself has been found not to be that effective. Here's why. In order for you to refute something, you have to state the original falsehood and then a statement that refutes it. Well, in doing so, you are amplifying that falsehood. As I mentioned before, falsehood travels further and faster and has much more appeal. So in effect, you're also amplifying and spreading the falsehood that you're trying to fight. As I mentioned, there's no data sharing by big tech on data that is related to information campaigns. There's very little public-private collaboration between big tech, government, and research institutions. So the first step would be to better understand influence campaigns and countermeasures, be able to set up control tests to see what actually works, regularly collect data, update quantitative data, test hypotheses. So there needs to be a permanent mechanism for this collaborative research. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace has advocated a multi-stakeholder research and development center. This would be a research entity that is funded and supported by social media, but has to operate independently. But remember that the biggest thing about battling disinformation is getting to it before the amplification stage. So to contain viral spread, in the absence of herd immunity, epidemiologists suggest quarantine or isolation of infected individuals and super spreaders. So similarly, in the absence of large-scale media literacy or critical thinking skills, we need to take measures to isolate the super spreaders and discern and disable the amplification infrastructure they rely on. For example, we could deplatform some of them. We know that Twitter and Facebook have, and they've done it based on violating their terms of use. Or we could reform Section 230 to enable them to do that. But more importantly, we can enact some product functions. So revising and limiting the follow function so that it will be harder for their followers harder for them to gain additional followers, and harder for the followers to automatically be able to get their feed, requiring the tech giants to provide transparency on the number of fake accounts and bot activity on an ongoing basis. Doing something on a product change to be able to discern in terms of likes and trending what's actually human versus what is bot activity. And then transparency on algorithm design. In other words, being able to understand the impact of that algorithm to the best possible means before that algorithm is instituted, or being able to audit them afterwards. Enacting product changes to minimize number of shares. WhatsApp has already done that. So you can't massively share everything. You have to go one by one. This is a change to the default share all. And then third-party rating of platforms based on the prevalence of fake accounts and bot activity. Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. Democracy is fragile. We should do our best now. Thank you.
Wow, Alexa, that was a lot to think about. And I think stuff that's near and dear to everyone's heart right now. So thank you for running through all the facts. I have a quick question for you, and then I'm going to ask you to head over to the Q&A discussion. Alex Howard, who has obviously been a big part of the conversation around this conference over the last few years, has some concerns about the idea that we militarize cyberspace, that we look at it as information warfare. And Mike Nelson, who obviously you know, also said we need to reframe this as the sort of data sphere, that if we apply traditional thinking of ideas like attack surfaces and warfare, we risk militarizing things that are collaborative. And Mike proposes a lot of reframings. One example was, he said, instead of saying, that's my data, we should say that's data about me, in the same way that I would say that's my car, but I would say it's a photograph of me. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about the perils of using military thinking and sort of the assumptions that sets in place when it's obvious that we see these things as acts by, foreign powers who would do us harm? Does that undermine the potential benefits of this sort of collected community? How do we avoid throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
Right. I think the crux of my talk was that the internet can be used for good and for bad, right? The very features that enables it to be very open and quote unquote egalitarian has also allowed bad actors at the common stage. I think we do need to think of these adversaries, these adversarial nation states in militaristic terms, because they certainly do think of us that way. They certainly do think of their attacks that way. So as I showed the MITRE process, starting with reconnaissance and weaponization, that is how they think. So if we are going to defeat them, we do need to understand their thinking. That said, the benefits of internet and what it has already delivered has largely been around open source and collaboration and a multi-stakeholder model. So this is why this public-private collaboration of being able to better understand the data, being able to better understand the impacts, auditing these algorithms before they go into effect will help. So I think it's not, no solution is either one or the other. I think we just need to be able to think the way the enemy thinks, but also harness the way that we've seen work and help solve larger problems like international collaboration, use that to our advantage.
Yeah, I think the challenge here is if it's a war, if it's information warfare, how do you know we've won? Like, what does victory look like? Is it that we can have free, truthful, unfettered conversations? It's kind of like the war on drugs or the war on terror.
Yeah.
Unless you know the adversary, it becomes a sort of military-industrial complex that Eisenhower was warning us about.
Yeah, and information warfare, the reality is we're at war. The adversary is a lot of times right at our heels or slightly ahead. There's been discussion about using AI, for example, but you got to understand the adversary uses AI as well. So we could use AI, but then help them to train their algorithms on ours. So it is a constant. A friend of mine who is an epidemiologist told me that I should be talking about this not in terms of a pandemic, but an endemic. Endemic is something that is long running. She was talking about COVID.
Now.
Yeah, and this the same.